Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week from the Plugin Alliance is ADPTR Audio Metric AB. ADPTR Audio is a new member of the Plugin Alliance. Their first plugin release is the Metric AB plugin. This is a pretty amazing one. It's a mix and master comparison tool with a variety of other tools that you don't normally see in reference plugins. And it's pretty sophisticated, so let's just dive right into it. Essentially what you have here are levels for your DAW, which is the A setup, and the B setup here will show you levels from any one of 16 references that you can load in and select. You switch back and forth between them, hitting the A-B button, and you can also monitor, in addition to stereo, you can also monitor in mono, left, right, or the side signal. You could shrink it down if you're no need for all of the display information. And when you're first beginning, you can enable tooltips. So as you actually go through all of the different settings, it will explain how you use that particular feature. There are 6 different modes that you can work in. In playback mode, you will have a whole bunch of different looping and cue storage points and settings that you can store for each one of the 16 references that you load in. You can save those settings up here and store them. If you drag and drop files in from, which you can do, from a variety of different locations, you can create an archive which will store them all in a singular location. These presets and all of this comes in very handy, particularly for mastering in situations where if you're working on a particular style of music, say hip-hop, you can load in your favorite 16 hip-hop references so that you can go back and forth and kind of compare yourself with what the latest stuff is out there. So you have playback, you have the spectrum analyzer, you have the phase correlation, you have the stereo imaging, you have the dynamics, and you also have loudness comparison. So all of that is at the ready. Now, when you actually work with different references, you can load them in to any slot just by simply selecting Load Audio. If you have a just go here quickly to your Finder or to your browser. You can drag any reference song right into any slot from any location, and it will store that location in the settings. When you save it, it'll actually save in the DAW. You can grab a whole bunch of them and drag them in. It will just fit them right into the slots automatically. So you can load them individually. If you want to expel one, then you could just simply remove the audio file here. Or just, if you wanted to load one individually, you could go here to the same place and load in a different master, and it will load it all right into there. So loads of options. You could ways of dragging all of this stuff in. Once you have the individual files in, there's loads of ways that you can play them back. So when you're working with the A/B tool, essentially what you're doing is you're hitting the space bar and it's going into play. What happens with the reference track is can be set individually for each song. So I'll explain a little bit about this. So it may be, for example, that you have a particular song, and in this particular song, you want the playback always to start from a particular location. So by default, when you set it up, it'll start off in latch mode, and it will start the playback from when you hit the space bar from whatever that playback position is. So I'm just going to mute the audio here just so we don't need to listen, but you could see the playback. So I hit the space bar, and it starts. And now when in Pro Tools, for example, here, if I'm starting from the same verse 2 location here, when I hit play, it will also put the reference into playback here. Okay, so I can see that it's just picking up from where it left off. So that's the first mode. If I go into cue mode, then what it'll do is it'll always start from the same location, in this case from the beginning. Now, what I can do here is I can also store cue points. So if I drag one of these cue points up to a particular location, now every time I hit the space bar, it will play back from that location. This is really handy for a variety of reasons. Even if you're comparing your mix up against an earlier version of the same mix or somebody else's version of the same mix, and you're working on a particular section, you can store a cue start point. You have 4 of them here. You can set up a loop. So if you were just playing back along the way, you could just hit the loop button. It would store in a loop position, which you can drag out. You could store multiple settings. So if I have another one here, like I could store another cue point here, you can drag them onto the display. And each one can have its own loop settings. So you can set the loop individually for any one of these individual setups. So you could set them up for individual sections of the song just for quick comparison. And that way, when you're working, it's always following kind of where you are. Now, there's another mode here which may solve that problem more specifically if it's the exact same song, which is to work into sync mode. So when you work in sync mode, wherever you are in the DAW, the cue playback will continue from there. So if I hit the space bar, it may be from here. If I skip over to an earlier section of the song, it will skip to that section of the song accordingly. So it will follow the setup of your DAW. There's also a cool feature here because sometimes the beginning of the song in the DAW may have a 2-bar lead in and your reference file starts right from the beginning. So if I do this and set my DAW to that location, you can see that's probably a couple bars in. I hit the set button and now they start from the exact beginning. So I can line up for A-B comparison when I work. So you see there's loads of options. There's also a manual mode. When you're enabling manual mode, then you could just hit play right from here. You could have it looping in the background over and over in the same section. And in that kind of mode, it's just looping around in the background and it's not triggered by when you hit the A-B button. So normally when you hit the A button, you're listening to the DAW. You flip the B button, it starts the playback, or gives you the audio from there. But this can just be looping around in the background. So each of these settings is individual to each song that you lay on there. So every individual song can have its own cue points, have its own loop setup, have its own mode that you do it in. If you want to work with different modes, you can see here, like I have one song that I can set up in latch mode, and another song here I can set up the same exact reference in sync. So I could have two different settings for the same master just stored in different slots. So you see the possibilities here with all the playback. Another thing that quite often happens, and I have this sort of set up a little bit more in a mastering scenario here where I've maximized the gain to do demonstrations there, but in particular with a mix, and even with mastering, if you bring in, say, a mastered commercial reference file and you bring it into your mix, one of the issues that you'll have is that the gain will be off. Obviously, the gain will be much higher. So if, for example, I take, that's the Master Desk. That's another plugin by the Plugin Alliance. If I take these settings off here, I can go back here to another song, and I can... All right, so let me set these up in sync. So cue up to another place. You went your way, and I went mine, tripping slowly down the road. So what happened here is I played back the audio file. This is another reference that I have. It's actually of the same song, and now when I compare them A to B, by hitting the match, it will match based on loudness. So now when I go back and forth between them, it'll automatically match the gain. So if you have a mix and you're bringing in a commercial reference that's already gain maximized, it will pull the level down or raise the level up if you're working in the opposite direction to match the gain. So now when you do the A-B comparison, you have something that's going to be closer to what you want it to be. And you can always click and drag to adjust it if you feel it's like a little bit off to your ears, and match it up that way. Again, these settings are stored for each individual setup. So as you go through each song, if you wanted to clear those track settings, you could just go in there and clear them for the individual track, and you're set up and you're all good to go. So loads of stuff. So this is just the beginning, because this is just getting into basic playback, the 4 cue storage points. You also have filters. So these filters are filters that can be actively used. So you can filter down the audio to a particular area. Like say you want to work just on the low end, you could set a low pass filter and pull it all the way down to like 100 hertz or something like that. And then you can listen to just what's going through the subs and compare A-B there just to hear what's in that particular range. So you have filters that are on the end for that, which you can enable. Right now they're just set for their maximum points, 10 hertz and 22,000 hertz. Let's go over to some of the other analysis tools here. And I'm going to bypass the, put this back in so I can talk over so you can see audio and then we can show some of the other visuals. So here, if we go over to the spectrum analysis, then you get a spectrum analysis. And for all of these selections, you have 3 different display modes. You have the single display mode, which will give you A/B analysis here. You have dual, which will show them side by side, as you see here, and you can layer them, showing in between. Now, depending upon the mode that you'll get some different settings here. So you have peak and you have average. So you can select if you just wanted to view peak signals or maybe you just wanted to view average. You could see here the orange is always the reference selected down here. So maybe I select another reference here. And the blue is always the DAW. So you'll see it in solid is the one that you have selected. That's the display color difference there. So you have peak and average settings here. You can zoom in to those. So if you want a higher resolution here, you can increase the resolution and the focus, for where you want it in on any particular area. So that just allows you to do it on that end. And then also you can zoom into particular frequencies. So for example, here I can pull this down and say I wanted to just focus on a particular mid-range area. I can focus in on the frequencies and the comparison and get a much more accurate A/B there right within that particular frequency range. So I'll set it back to normal. So we have the full frequency response. So you have a lot of tools here that you're working with. You can also link those to the filters so that if you zoom into a particular range, it also zooms in the filters to that particular range. Again, it just kind of goes on and on. You get all the possibilities here. There's also a phase correlation meter. So this will show you in phase versus out of phase, the amount of energy. So you see the overall dynamic up and down here in the solid area, and then you'll see the phase as it's there. You can clear the display here, and then just see the comparison here. Again, you have range, hold, and average. And this, you can also show a history. So this will show you the phase relationship history versus the meters. Again, there's loads of things here. You can work in a variety of different modes. Actually, I'll just go back to the spectrum analyzer because if you don't like that particular display, you can work in octave bands. You can also show in third octave bands, in critical listening, and also in a multiband. Now, there are settings for the spectrum analyzer and all of the other settings here, which shows the type of window. So if you're in all of that and the FFT size, weighting, if you want to add any weighting, so it adds all that in. The B-track reset means that if you switch to another reference file, it will reset the settings on reset the display. Otherwise, it'll just kind of keep the histories as they go by. And this is where you set or offset or change these multiband areas. So you have all the crossovers for those bands if you want to adjust them to some particular settings. Again, when you store all of these settings, they can get saved here, simple save or save as, and we'll store all those settings so that when you load this up, you can load up maybe references that you use to tune your ears all the time. So just as you're mixing, could be completely unrelated other than just having it set up so that you can just kind of switch to some other material to make sure you're not going too far in a particular direction. Have 16 of your favorite songs loaded up and just kind of switch between them while you're, maybe setting up some other things. Just kind of keep your ears fresh. Okay, so loads of settings there, loads of options here. With the phase correlation, you also have the same types of things. So you could see, the phase correlation, maybe more, set up within octaves or something like that. So you could see if there's a particular problem, like your low end is out of phase in a particular part of the song, that type of thing. And again, with the history, you can see that over time. So then you can find out exactly where that area is and correct that problem. There's also a stereo imaging. Now, as we go here, this is showing octave, but then you get all of the displays here as well. So this is just showing the amount of left-right energy. In this particular song, in the beginning, there's a guitar that starts over on the left side. So when I switch over there, you'll see that all the energy switches over there, and then a couple seconds later, a guitar on the right-hand side picks up, and you'll see the energy start to center more. So this is just showing left-right strength by comparison, and you can see here. So this is not a phase meter. And again, you have all of the different things which allow you to go full frequency, into your multi crossover, third octave, whatever, however you want to display it. Just loads of options there. There's also dynamics. This is kind of an interesting one. The dynamics works on PSR. And if you're not familiar with what PSR is and a lot of the loudness measurements, PSR is a peak to short-term loudness ratio. So this is our perception of loudness over the course of 3 seconds. And this will give you a good measure, and this is a great tool for mastering in particular, because you can measure the short-term loudness, and this will give you the peak to loudness ratio over that short-term area. This is quite handy because even if you're doing a mix where your mix is not necessarily maximized, this number can actually be very valuable because it will give you an idea without doing any limiting what your loudness level would essentially be at. Now, there's an auto scale here, which kind of makes this pretty cool, but you can essentially select from a variety of different standards. You could set a target PSR. So maybe you want to be loud. So when you set that, it sets that red target level to -7, which looks like it's probably off to display. And all right, so there we go. So there we see it there. And so you could see sort of the dynamics history sort of passing by here. Now, if I do it into competitive, that's probably a little bit more. So that's the PSR to -9. So for those that are into mastering, usually to me, like -8 is that kind of crossover point where if you go anything, below -8 into -7, you're getting into pretty crushed, they call crushed 3. And these are just some presets that kind of go here, but you could also take and drag the numbers and kind of move them wherever you want the target to be. And it will show that relative to the material that you're actually working on, which is quite cool. So you could see that. There's also a little reset here that works with all of the displays as well. When you're working. And if you want to see them layered over the top of each other, then sometimes that's a little bit more handy for this type of display here. So as you're metering everything, that's kind of happening here, we can see the reference to our mix in blue here to see what those differences are. Okay, and you see that they're not exactly synced up here. Okay, so loads of stuff on that end. That's actually very cool, handy, especially more geared towards mastering. The loudness is another one here. So let's go back. We could see as our DAW, our loudness here. So we can get a measurement of that. Let me skip over to an area where it's a little bit more intense. And again, we can set targets. Now this one has more target presets. And again, you could also drag it in there, but if you just basically say I want a competitive master, it's setting that at -10. If you want something that's loud, it's going to set it to -8. And what we can do is we can now have a comparison. So when you see these meters go into the red, that means it's crossing over that line of loudness. Now, if we go to the layered display here, it's kind of cool because you'll see the integrated loudness side by side, the short-term and the momentary loudness, which occurs over 400 milliseconds, I think. And you can see all the individual numbers for LUFS, and LUFS for integrated short-term momentary loudness range. Again, you can show a history, right? So we could see a full history. I can just kind of clear that by hitting the reset button here. We could see them, separated from each other. This is not particularly interesting, although if you're going if we auto scale this, we'll start to see the differences a little bit better. There we go. So the auto scale will be like an auto zoom in, so you can kind of see where your peak levels are and where your loudness is. And you could see the 3 different scales there. You could see the integrated, You could see the short term, and then you could see the momentary as it's going through all of its measurements. And you could set the time, for the scrolling, or you could just show meters. Both are very handy. So from the mastering perspective, this is also another way that you can kind of manage working with the plugin. Again, you can map this out. It also has it can be mapped to a controller. So if you want to map it out that way, you can have it set up where you do the A/B comparison or on some other kind of switcher MIDI device, and uh, loads and loads of options. It's a very, very powerful tool. The more I dig on into this, the more stuff that I find in here. I didn't even get into all of the individual settings that you could do for, the peak and the hold and the average. There's just loads of stuff that's in here that's very valuable for comparison. Again, for mixing or mastering, you can make it really simple. If you shrink down the display size, you can just go through different references that way. It will show you the name here so that you can see it here, and just have the quick A/B just to shrink it down. And if you want to look at the different displays, do side-by-side comparisons, there's loads of ways to visualize it and to use it. A very powerful one. This is an amazing tool. To me, there's nothing that even comes close to it in terms of an A/B comparison tool. And with all of the preset storing and the ability to store all of your references in a single place, it just makes things so much easier as you collect reference masters, whether you're doing mixing or just great sounding mixes that just sort of keep your ears tuned in. Load them up, gain match them, store it as a preset, and you're good to go. You could just load them up every time you do a session. Very valuable one. And another great addition from the Plugin Alliance. So we can welcome ADPTR Audio to them, and their plugin of the week from Mixing with Mike, the Metric AB plugin from the Plugin Alliance, ADPTR Audio.